2 weeks, sometimes monthly, so there could have been a long time, between these stalling visits. So don't forget that. So in that sense, ask lots of revision-based questions as you go through this briefing. When you get to the objective slide, let's just put up the grid. When you get to the objective slide, you may just have to go back and redefine a few terms, like if onset appears in here, go back and actually talk about what the onset is. The term, I don't think it comes up in this briefing, but the term fully developed stall is sometimes used synonymously with wing drop stalls. It's actually not correct. A fully developed stall is just one where the aeroplane has stalled and it is sinking. It applies to every single kind of stall that there is. That's a wing drop. That's also a basic stall where you go through to the stall, a stall in the steep turn, a dynamic stall, an approach stall, all of them fully developed if you go right through to the stall and you're getting the sink, so just be aware of that. You might have to recap on what we treat as the onset, because it's different in different organisations. The big point you want to get to on this slide is there is still a standard recovery, but it is a slightly modified version for a wing drop stall. And from today, the student needs to develop their discipline to make sure they follow that standard recovery. Because I guarantee you, the first time you direct a student through one of these or you analyse them, a wing will drop, and the first thing they'll do is hold either aileron. They all do it. So it's a discipline thing. We need to get out of that habit. Potentially quite a lot of revision on this slide. There shouldn't be anything new here. So lots of questions. You might have to help them with some of the answers. There are some similarities here and there's some differences. So they've been through the coefficient lift curve before. So you could ask them, what does this curve actually show us? But then a couple more clicks brings up the coefficient of drag curve. Now they've not been introduced to that before in any briefing, so just give an overview of what's actually being shown there. And then a couple more clicks brings you a few lines that's labeled left and right wing. So this is where you can talk about what's actually happening to the principles of flight in terms of lift and drag on the stalled and the unstalled wing. The following slide is quite a nice link. So this is where you can really highlight there that why is it rolling? Why is it yawing? Back here, I just talk about the fact that one wing has more lift, one wing has more drag. I don't generally relate on this slide to the fact that that causes yaw and roll, but here is where you can summarise that. Otherwise, you just end up repeating yourself on this slide. Obviously, you need to have a bit of a chat about why a wing drop might occur. Look, if you actually look at this list, they almost all are about aileron use. So highlight that. You're most likely to have a wing drop stall if you are using aileron at or close to the critical angle. Almost all of those up there are about aileron use. So just expand briefly on these things. There are some speaker notes about most of them, but we covered a lot of this, I believe, in the stall package from last semester. This is really just emphasising why it's important not to use aileron. It should flow quite nicely on from what you were explaining somewhere back here, that, hey, we're rolling, we're yawing, how could we stop the roll? And they might say, oh yeah, with aileron, so then this leads you into here, explaining why you do not want to use aileron to try and stop the roll. So the point is, well, what else is there to stop this cycle of yaw and roll? Well, there's the rudder. So we have to use sufficient rudder to stop that process. Shouldn't be anything untoward on this next slide. Probably just some revision-based things here. One thing, and don't mention this to your students, but when it actually comes time to actually sending them to practice this solo, make sure you've seen them demonstrate wing drop stalls a number of times on separate lessons before you actually allow them to go solo. And if they've entered an unusual attitude, great, there's a bit of awareness there now of how to recover from one of those. But certain aeroplanes give quite aggressive wing drop stall recoveries. So I always remember the first time my instructor set me up solo to do wing drop stalls in a Cessna 152. I went up and I practiced only basic stalls because I was absolutely terrified of wing drop stalls because they are really aggressive sometimes. And you know, after only doing 2 dual lessons on it, I didn't want to go practice them on my own. And the instructor asked me, how'd it go? Yeah, good, yeah, really good. Yep. Didn't tell him I didn't do wing drop stalls. So that kind of thing does happen. And I think back to my training and I think, well, why was I feeling like that? I probably needed a few more lessons on it to actually get the confidence, and the instructor needed to sit back and say nothing. Just leave me to deal with it, see what happened, and could I recover from any unusual attitudes. That's how you'll know that a student is ready to go up and do this. Actually, all the maneuvers are like that. If you can just sit back, say nothing, the student A is able to demonstrate the correct recovery, B, recover from an unusual attitude if one of those happens, then you know you're ready to get out and actually let them go and do this solo. So be prepared that they will be apprehensive. This should just largely be revision based. Your exercise, you could turn this into questions as well. So talk about, hey, do you remember the recovery from an approach stall or a basic stall? Again, you could get them to come up on the whiteboard and draw it up, or just get them to run through it out loud, or you just go click, 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 run through it. But again, it's not a completely different recovery, it's just a slightly modified version. So make sure you tell them that so they don't think, oh, now I've got to remember another stall recovery, you know, the basic stall recovery, the approach stall recovery, the wing drop stall recovery, the stall and the turn recovery. It's not like that, there's just a few additional steps. You can run through the symptoms again, a bit of revision on that. What have we got here? Recovery, about that. There is a little bit on unusual attitude recoveries. So that's really important because occasionally the student will enter an unusual attitude. And it's a good learning opportunity if they do, provided it's with you on board. So really guide them through that. If it's safe to actually guide them through it rather than just take control of the aeroplane, then I'd always try and do that because they could enter one of these on their own, so they need to know how to actually recover from it. Somewhere in here as well, on one of these slides, mention what are your expectations around what if the aeroplane gets to the point of stall, it's buffeting and the nose is pitching down, it's sinking, but the wing is not dropping. What are you wanting them to do in that situation? What do we want a student to do? Oh, that's a genuine question. You tell me.
Just recover?
Yeah, recover as for a basic stall or an approach stall way. But you do not want them to hold it in there because then you're more likely to get a really aggressive stall. But it's not even about that, it's bad learning to hold an aeroplane into the stall, hoping that it actually develops a little bit more. Certainly didn't want to do that close to the ground. I don't think there's anything else in terms of instructional techniques we need to discuss. Complete tangent. Don't mention this to your students, but Richie failed a PPL candidate for holding the aeroplane into the stall. It might not have been last semester, but a couple of semesters ago, because he said, well, show me a wing drop stall. And they lost about 500 feet before finally it wing dropped, and then they recovered. But Richie said, no, that's not acceptable, and failed it. Probably one more point, more for you. Have any of you flown Cessnas? I've probably passed this before, but no?
Briefly.
Okay, that's fine, but you know, most of you will at some point in your instructing careers, whether it be sooner or later, will fly Cessnas, 152s, 172s. They all give fairly good wing drop stalls. For your own personal benefit and confidence, and you will want to go and make sure you are comfortable actually doing those yourself first, because one, recovery and a type rating issue, that's not enough to know that you're comfortable. You need to do several of them at least. Unusual attitude recoveries, would be helpful as well. You wouldn't want to throw yourself into a situation of teaching a new student these if you've only ever demonstrated one during your type rating test. I've ended up upside down a few times in 152s because they throw in the aileron and it rotates really rapidly, so you want to have your hands close by so you can grab the throttle and the controls. Look, that doesn't happen often. We're talking about that happened to me twice over, I don't know, 8 years of instructing, but you've got to be prepared for it because worst case scenario, that's what's going to happen. Not to terrify you or anything. Where's the mouse gone? Any questions about any of the instructional stuff? Look, you'll talk more about this when you actually teach this lesson with your instructor as well, but those are just a few things I would also like to point out. No questions? Oops, wrong slide. Has this thing working before?
The Logitech?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was open.
There we go. So wing drop stalls today. So ask questions like how long ago was it since they did their last stall lesson? What did you think of those approach stalls that you did? Will we be revising those in today's lesson? It's another lesson to give you the full picture or very well-rounded understanding of what a stall is and the factors affecting it, the symptoms, as well as how to recover from it. So it just flows on from your approach stalls. Today's lesson in particular will be reviewing basic stalls, reviewing approach stalls, reviewing symptoms and standard recoveries, but in your previous lessons, both of the wings of the aeroplane stalled at the same time, and there was no unusual tendencies for the aeroplane to roll or yaw when stalled. Today, however, we're going to look at the stalls where the aeroplane does roll and does yaw, and we'll learn the slightly amended or slightly modified version of the standard recovery for that. So after today, no matter what the aeroplane does at the stall, you will have the skills and the confidence to be able to recover as for a basic stall, where both wings stall at the same time, and also if the aeroplane rolls and yaws at the point of stall. Here are our objectives for today. We'll revise stalling with power and flap, recovering at the onset. So you remember what the onset was? Yep, well, that's right. We treat that as the buffet at NASI in a DA40. I don't know if it's the PowerPoint or that thing, but this is the word. There we go. We're also going to carry out a wing drop stall from straight and level flight, recovering with minimum height loss. So why do you think we might want to recover with minimum height loss? So, just go back, recap on that, see if they remember, because we are most likely to accidentally or inadvertently stall the aeroplane when we are close to the ground where there isn't a lot of height to recover. So make that link, because really it's when you're close to the ground that you're most likely to stall. And to improve your situational awareness, we are going to talk about the symptoms today and recover at the onset. We really want to recover as early as possible before any tendencies for roll and yaw actually occurred. So what is a wing drop stall? Do you remember why a stall occurred? So ask that question if you like, or something along those lines. See if they can remember what a stall occurred. What you may have to get out of them is, a stall occurs because we reached a critical angle of attack and the airflow separates and there's not enough lift, so the aeroplane sinks and it is stalled. So the same thing happens with a wing drop stall, but we're now talking about that one wing has stalled before the other, and this creates roll and yaw tendencies. Why do we need to practice this? We've highlighted a few of these already, but just in case one accidentally happens to us on our approach to land or after taking off, we want to know what the recovery is immediately, as we'll be close to the ground. We want to practice it, so it's an automatic response, so we don't have to think about how to recover from this, just as we discussed with your basic stalls and your approach stalls. And today is also about developing discipline with the slightly modified standard recovery procedure as well. So we'll recap a bit on the principles of flight from some of the previous lessons. Let's imagine we're out in the southern training area, we've done our Hazel checks, and we are going to practice a stall and talk about what's actually going on with the principles around a wing. So imagine we're slowing down, the throttle's back at idle, we're getting closer and closer to the critical angle. Finally, we're right on the verge of a stall. What happens to the central pressure as we get closer and closer to the critical angle? This whole slide should just be revision, right? Now, what about when we actually stall? What happened to this? What happened to lift? Oh yeah, it reduced. What about the centre of pressure? What happened there? Ah yes, it moved up. And what happened to drag? Yep, that increased as well. So how did the aeroplane respond? Oh yes, the nose pitched down, it started sinking. So nothing new here, right? Just ask all those questions. You could even ask, well, why is it that the nose pitched down? See if they remember that from the stalling briefing as well. Something we discussed in the basic stalls brief was the coefficient of lift curve. So do you remember what this curve shows you? You might be able to rattle off a few answers about that, or you might have to guide them through it. What does this curve actually tell us in relation to a stall? Well, this is a question for you guys.
That occurs in an angle of attack.
Yep, a particular angle of attack. As we're slowing down, getting closer and closer to the critical angle, is this curve actually telling us that the lift is getting more and more and more? Is that actually what would be happening in the aeroplane? Because that's what the curve says. It says the curve shows that as we slow down, as the angle of attack gets bigger, the lift would get bigger. Is that what actually happens when we do this lesson? Any stall lesson? No, this actually lift stays the same, isn't it? Equal to weight. And then finally we get to here where the lift starts reducing. So just be careful with the reason I went through that is because just be careful with how they reply to that. Make sure they do actually have a clear understanding of what's happening to lift there as you get closer to the stall. Now something new for you. Not only is there a coefficient of lift curve, but there's also a coefficient of drag curve. So coefficient of drag expresses the drag producing qualities of a wing at different angles of attack. You can see it has what we call an exponential relationship with angle of attack. It's not linear. The amount of drag increases more and more and more as the angle of attack increases. Minimum coefficient of drag, somewhere around 0 degrees angle of attack, and then it increases as we get closer to that stall angle, and then rapidly increases from the stall angle onwards. That's all the information you need to give there, okay? Just basics, that's all. So let's talk about the wing drop stall. We'll imagine that we're out in the southern training area and the aeroplane has stalled, but one wing has stalled before the other. So let's take a look at what's actually happening to the lift and drag. So a couple of lines are going to come up here. Let's say this green line represents the right-hand wing of the aeroplane, and this red line represents the left-hand wing of the aeroplane. When you explain this, if they're getting confused about which way this is going, you need to qualify that the aeroplane would be flying out of the board towards them, okay? Otherwise they'll get it all around the wrong way. So the aeroplane has just stalled. The left-hand wing here is at a higher angle of attack. It's past that critical angle of attack. It's at about, what is it? It's about 18 degrees, let's say. So it's definitely stalled, and therefore it will produce less lift than the other wing. Because it's past the critical angle of attack, it also is producing more drag. So just highlight that. If they don't understand what's being shown on the graphs, you'll have to really point that out to them. Do you understand how that's being shown on the graphs? Do you all get that? How there's more drag being shown because you're up here, there's less lift because you're over there. So just make sure you really highlight that to your student. So what's actually going on with the aeroplane here? From the previous slide, we saw that there will be an imbalance in lift and there will be an imbalance in drag. So this imbalance of drag is going to cause the aeroplane to yaw in the direction of the stalled wing, in this case towards the left-hand side. That imbalance in lift is going to cause the aeroplane to roll in the direction of the stalled wing. So we're going to get yaw and roll, as well as the aeroplane sinking and the nose pitching down. Those things will still happen. So let's talk about why this might even happen now. Most of the reasons for a wing drop stall are related to aileron use. Do you remember what happens when we use ailerons? You know, think back to effects of control as you talk to them about what happens to angle of attack, right? See if they can remember that stuff from all the way back then. Oh yeah, the angle of attack increased, right? So if we're using aileron when we are close to the stall, that aileron use might just increase the angle of attack enough to tip one wing above the critical angle. So as we talk about all these factors, let's imagine we've reduced the power, we've slowed down, we're right at the point of the stall, at the critical angle, and we'll talk about how these factors are actually going to cause a wing drop. Aileron use we've covered already. Turning is another one, which essentially is the same thing as aileron use, because if we are turning, we will have a difference in the angle of attack. One wing will have a slightly higher angle of attack. That may be just enough to tip it above the critical angle. Being out of balance is another one. Students not going to know the answer to this, but what is the reason why being out of balance actually can cause a wing drop?
Shielding.
Shielding, yep.
One wing produces more.
Good. So if you've got it, is there a model in here? Oh, there is. So you might have to grab the old model out and actually show them that, you know, if we are yawing at the point of stall, there's some shielding there, so this wing here is going to produce more lift. Roll tendency. What else is there in relation to being out of balance?
The is it yours? It's going to travel faster.
Yeah. So
Secondary
being out of balance suggests, yeah, exactly. Being out of balance suggests that the aeroplane is yawing, therefore one wing will travel faster, more lift, less likely to stall on this wing, more likely to stall on this one. Ice or damage. See if they can remember back to, what would it be, approach stalls for this one. No difference here. Maybe one wing has got more dents on it, or maybe one wing is covered in bird droppings, or is covered in some ice. Disturbs the smooth, streamlined flow of air, more likely to separate on that wing first. So that wing will stall and you'll get a wing drop. Why does this cause a wing drop? You could ask a student if you wanted, probably not going to know. Why does a weight imbalance possibly cause a wing drop?
Lateral displacement of that center of gravity.
How does that cause a wing drop though?
Moment.
What about it though?
It's going to be, one of the wings is going to have a greater arm than the other.
Why would that cause a wing drop?
Because
It's something more simple. If you've got an imbalance in weight on one side of the aeroplane's going to want to roll, and you're going to have to use aileron to stop it from rolling. You're using aileron, you're increasing the angle of attack on one wing. I'd just keep it really simple like that. Turbulence, so relate it to maybe some of the previous stall lessons. When they did slow flight, you felt the aeroplane being buffeted around, you had to use the stick to keep the wings level, didn't you? Now imagine we're right on the fringe of the stall at the critical angle, big gust of turbulence causes the aeroplane to start rolling. You instinctively push the stick to one side to keep the wings level, that could cause you to stall. Rigging, I think some speaker notes on that, but it's probably not so relevant to our more modern aeroplanes, but old Cessnas and even older machines, all the controls in the wings may not be perfectly or symmetrically rigged, so one wing may have a slightly different angle of attack compared to the other. that might cause one wing to stall before the other. This probably also relates to flap as well, because we use flap for wing drop stalls, so if one flap is extended slightly more than the other, there'll be a slightly different angle of attack for each of the wings. You could ask some questions around this one. Do they remember the effect of slipstream? What does it cause? What happens if we add power? Oh, yeah, it causes yaw, and we've just talked about being out of balance, so this is going to potentially cause a wing drop as well. Flaps. We talked about the rigging, but why do flaps potentially cause a wing drop? Students not going to know this question for you guys.
Don't they kind of cancel the effects of like washout on the wing?
I've never heard that one before, but explain that to me.
Because you're effectively. I take it back.
Any other ideas?
They bring lift, and which making it less laterally steep.
Yeah, the centre of pressures move inwards
Yeah,
because
that's
the
what I
flaps
think,
only come down on the inboard sections, right? So you're then more prone to disturbances. So one way I usually show it, I don't particularly want to drop the model because these are quite fragile. A ruler would probably be better. Do we have a ruler? We do. A small ruler would be even better, but if the centre of pressures are way out there, nothing really happening, right? If I disturb it, it's pretty stable, but if I bring the centre of pressures inwards now and get disturbed, it's not stable. So that's the reason behind it.
Hey Matt.
Yep.
For the out of balance one and that one with the, is that something you would go in detail with your student, or would you
The
just
out of balance one.
and the flap one, like using the for the flat out of balance one, you use the model, and then for the
Yeah,
flap one,
absolutely.
You would go
Because
in
there
detail.
are a few speaker notes on the out of balance stuff, I think, there that talk about it. So you're talking about the shielding very briefly. That's something you've talked to them about before, and the yaw causing the difference in the speed. You've talked to them about that before, so it's actually not new. So no problem with talking about that. What was the other one? Flaps, did you say?
yeah, like going into detail with the ruler and that.
Yeah, really simple. Just grab the ruler out and just show will they actually reduce the stability. They make the aeroplane more likely to roll. So grab the ruler, show them that.
Cool.
Takes 30 seconds most, so you might as well do it. So there's lots of factors that can cause an aeroplane to drop a wing at the point of stall. Most relate to aileron use. So before you click to the next slide, you could ask them, well, aeroplane's just stalled. You want to stop that roll. How are you going to stop this roll? See if they've actually put 2 and 2 together and realise that, hang on, we can't use aileron because that will actually make things worse. See what they say. It does bring up on the next slide the reasons why though. So let's imagine we did actually use aileron. That left-hand wing has stalled first, the right-hand wing hasn't stalled. Now if you use the ailerons to try and roll the wings back level again, look at what happens to the angle of attack on the left-hand wing. The angle of attack has gone from 18 degrees to something even bigger, 20 degrees. Has this solved the problems? No, it's made it even worse. The wing is now even more deeply stalled, which means even less lift on this wing and even more drag, which means even more yaw and even more roll. You've just made it worse. So how do we actually break this cycle of yaw and roll then? The only other flight control we have available to us that can do this is the rudder. So we use sufficient opposite rudder to stop this yaw and roll. So that's kind of a summary for that slide. Despite the aeroplane doing some things that you haven't seen before at the stall, this lesson is nothing to be apprehensive about. You're going to get plenty of practice with me on board before you practice this on your own. And we'll also have a look at unusual attitude recoveries or any other abnormal type recoveries before you practice this solo. So just reassure them because they, especially if they've got some previous experience, they may have already seen this in Cessnas and already be stressing about it. So reassurance is important. situational awareness here relates to the symptoms. We never actually want to allow the aeroplane to accidentally stall. So we should be aware of all the symptoms as they're starting to happen around us. Recovering as soon as we notice any of them. We should not be recovering at the roll and yaw when the aeroplane stalls. But we do have to experience that today so that you understand what a wind drop stall looks like and know how to recover from one in the event that you accidentally get to that stage. Talked about this. How did you find your previous stalls? Did you find that they upset your tummy? You know, ask some questions about that if you even need to. You know, if they are your student, you'll know if it actually caused motion sickness in the basic stalls and approach stalls. I've never seen someone become motion sick from this kind of stall in a DA40. In Cessnas I have, just because of the more rapid roll and rapid yaw, but just monitor them. It's a real easy lesson for them to become overwhelmed in, so do keep an eye on them as you go through this. Why do you think we need to pay particular attention to the lookout below when we do our haze or hull checks? Ask questions like that, build on what you've taught them in previous lessons, and this should have been introduced in the basic stalls lesson as well, the pre-flight check. Recap on these, revision, you could get them to just say them out loud, or you could get them to draw it up on the board, whatever you want. Recap on this, just revision, ask them what the flap speeds are. Just a note that we only use takeoff flap for wing drop stalls. Everyone has the wrong idea about why we don't use landing flap. Someone once told me that, because I asked the same question when I started here, is why I'm using landing flap, and they told me that it's because all the students were breaching the landing flap speed in the recovery. And then when I asked PK about it, he said, no, that was nonsense. The reason that we actually use takeoff flap is because it apparently gives a better wing drop stall in the takeoff flap configuration than the landing flap. No idea why, I've never been able to get my head around that one, but PK's answer was, you don't go changing the way you teach something because a student isn't executing the correct recovery, because it's not their fault. It actually was probably the instructor's fault for not teaching them the correct recovery in relation to having landing flap extended. You don't need to tell your student that, that's just background stuff, just in case you ever get asked about why do we actually use takeoff flap and not landing flap. I have found that the DA40 actually gives a pretty good wing drop stall even without any flap, which Cessnas don't, so that's an oddity as well. You could ask them about why we'd have high RPM set, so we want full power available to us in the recovery. And then the year exercise, like I said, recap on an approach stall recovery, highlight there that there's a lot of similarities. There's still only one way that you can recover from the stall itself. What's the most important thing? Oh yeah, checking forward, reducing the angle of attack. So what we actually have a look at in the lesson today is we review approach stalls, because it's been a while since you've done any of those. I'll demonstrate a wing drop stall, and including the entry, we'll recap on the symptoms and talk about the recovery as well. When you get to entry, it all does come up at the same time. You can't sort of go click, click, click. So we'll complete our Hazel and Hell checks. Pick a prominent reference point, something that's easy for you to see with a high nose attitude, and pick a reference altitude as well, bug the heading, and then we'll smoothly reduce the power to 12 inches, just like the approach stall, the power flap stall entry. Below 108 knots, we'll set the takeoff flap, and just a slight check forward to maintain altitude as we do that. Continuing to slow down, maintain direction with rudder through 80 knots, set high RPM. At the stall warning, this is where it gets a little bit different. We'll relax the rudder pressure. So we're not going to take our feet off the pedals, we're just going to sit them very lightly on the pedals so that the aeroplane actually starts to yaw. We want it to yaw because DA40 is so stable, it's quite hard to get a wind drop stall out of them. So we'll relax the rudder pressure to allow the aeroplane to yaw. We'll increase the power slightly, just nudge the throttle up a little bit. You don't even need to look inside, it's just the briefest of nudges, but no more than 16 inches of manifold pressure, and continue to increase the back pressure slowly to maintain altitude. questions on the symptoms. You don't need to go over any of this. You might have to fill in a few blanks for them, but what are the symptoms? Oh yeah, we remember all of those, great. At the stall, what are we expecting? The nose to pitch down, the aeroplane to sink, and today, with a bit of luck, one wing will drop, so we will roll and we will yaw at the stall as well. So we've just had a wing drop stall, now we need to learn how to recover from one. So the most important thing is to reduce that angle of attack, so lowering the nose, think of it as a relaxation of the back pressure, and we want to check centrally forward on the stick, not use any ailerons. Sufficient opposite rudder to stop the yaw. Be careful with how you say that. It's wrong to say full opposite rudder. That's a spin recovery. For a wing drop stall, it is sufficient opposite rudder. Apply full power to minimize the height loss. We're used to doing that, aren't we? Then we'll roll the wings level smoothly, centralize the rudder, raise the nose to the climb attitude, and once we have a positive rate of climb, raise the flaps and climb back to our reference altitude and level off. Now, if this actually happened to us low down in the circuit, we're going to climb back up to circuit altitude, figure out why that happened, and make sure it doesn't happen again. What else can I tell you about this? Occasionally, on the DI desk, I've had students come to me saying, what do they say? They say, yep, check forward, opposite rudder, full power, but then some of them have in their mind that they're going to use the rudder to actually yaw and roll the aeroplane right back out of the turn. Like, you'd have to probably use full opposite rudder to do that. Some of them have, and more than a few, have said to me that's what they would do. Completely wrong, okay? You're more likely to actually cause a wing drop back in the opposite direction, and it will take them by surprise, and they won't react in sufficient time. So it's only enough rudder to stop the yaw, okay? You're still going to use the ailerons once the nose has been lowered and the stall has been recovered from. Make sure they really understand that. Be prepared that they will forget to use rudder. They will use aileron. They may lower the nose so far and then add full power that you do end up in an unusual attitude with the airspeed rapidly approaching VFE. All of these things will happen to you multiple times when you're teaching a student this. So be vigilant, be ready to intervene, and you'll get some training on this throughout your FIC flights as well. So then we talk about unusual attitudes. So occasionally the aeroplane may enter what we call an unusual attitude. This might be because we haven't followed the standard recovery, we've taken a little bit long to execute the recovery, we've done it wrong, or it could be other factors. There is only one minor difference. We're still going to check centrally forward on the stick to unstall the aeroplane, sufficient opposite rudder, but rather than apply full power here, we're going to roll the wings level, centralize the rudder, raise the nose to the climb attitude, and then apply full power as the airspeed returns to a normal speed. And by that I mean anything below 100 knots. We don't want to be adding power with the nose attitude nearly vertical. Then we'll climb back up to our reference altitude and level off again. Reasonably common. Okay, it's usually though with students, it's because they have checked forward way too much. It's not usually like they've held the aeroplane into the stall or anything. It's usually the opposite actually. One last closing note is we never hold the aeroplane into the stall in the hopes that we'll get a wing drop. Now I mentioned that the DA40 is very stable and sometimes it just does not want a wing drop, and you'll even see I had trouble getting it to wing drop sometimes. So if the aeroplane is stalled, it's buffeting, the nose is pitching down, it's sinking, wings not dropping, just recover as you learn for a basic stall or an approach stall, and we'll have another go. This does happen. Homework for them, if you're not flying on the day, I would expect them to make an effort to memorize the standard recovery, because in your pre-flight briefing you're going to really focus on that, because they need to develop the discipline to not use aileron. So it should only take about 25 minutes, I would suggest, largely revision based. What else can I tell you about Windrop stalls? Oh, the other thing you could mention to them is either wing could drop, so they need to make sure they're not memorising that it's always going to be left rudder that they need in the recovery. Students tend to do that if they're flying Cessnas because they almost always drop a wing to the left, so they always think, oh yeah, it'll be right rudder every single time. Whereas you, from your own experience, you probably know that A, wing drops are not great in a DA40, and B, they can drop in either direction, and they often do. So the student needs to not have the mindset that it's always going to be left or right rudder, because it does change. My instructor, when I was learning to fly, taught me a valuable lesson around these because, again, it always dropped to the left, and so I started putting in right rudder, so he stomped on the opposite rudder pedal and it flicks right over to the opposite side. But it scared the crap out of me, but it was a very valuable lesson. I wouldn't actually condone you guys doing that with the students, but it was an aerobatic machine, so that you actually could use full and abrupt movement at that speed, but don't do that in a DA.
Why does it drop right?
What's that?
Why would it ring drop right? Like,
Probably the slipstream, I would say. Yeah, because it's going to want to yaw in one direction, so it must have some effect on that, because otherwise everything else should be symmetrical. Slipstream, maybe rigging a flap in some of those older machines, but I mean, everything else should be the same. Or it could be wing contamination, maybe dents on one of the wings. Just always seems to be the left wing in a Cessna. Do you have any questions about anything there? Just make sure I haven't missed anything.
Haven't we already gone over what unusual attitude is to the student?
No, you won't have. So I just describe it as excessive nose-no attitude. That's usually what it is. Yep, that's a good point. Anything else?
Man, I just have a question for when we enter into the Windrop stall.
Yep.
I remember how I think I had this comment a few times in my training about doing it. When we have to the point where we like increase the power to roughly 16 or something run forward. Should we also explain that when you don't want to just do the power then increase back pressure, kind of make it like a slightly coordinated thing instead of doing one at a time?
I don't tend to mention it because the students getting a bit overwhelmed by this point, so I just say, so at the stall warning, relax the feet, a little bit of power, let it start to yaw, because they will try to stop it by using aileron. You actually want it to yaw, so let it yaw, slowly bringing the stick back, it'll stall, hopefully drop a wing, and then we'll recover. So just try to keep it really simple, because it's hard enough as it is without adding more detail. Make sure you do teach it that way as well. That's in our SOPs around what to actually do with your feet and the power in there, so you'll find all of that guidance there. So, what I often see when I'm teaching this to students is you tell them you relax your feet, add some power, and it does start to yaw, but then they immediately try to stop it, so you really need to tell them, no, let it yaw. It will also start to roll. It's not going to be anything like that. This is pre-stall, right? So you've added the power. It will start to do this, but that's fine. Just tell them to keep bringing the stick back centrally. Eventually it will stall. And if it's in this kind of attitude, when it stalls, you're more likely to actually get a wind drop. That's the idea behind it. Any other questions on that? these circuits then.